Welcome. Tonight, we will travel back to the mid-14th century, a time remembered most of all for one of the most devastating events in human history, the Black Death. But do not worry. Our journey will not be harsh or alarming. Instead, we will walk softly through the rhythms of daily life, through quiet streets and dimly lit homes, through the habits and thoughts of ordinary people. We will notice what they wore, what they ate, what they feared, and what gave them comfort. We will meet figures from the past, not as characters in a drama, but as distant companions whose stories can soothe us with their gentle unfolding. The Black Death was a vast and complicated event, stretching across continents, reshaping societies, and leaving lasting echoes. Yet for the people who lived through it, it was also something ordinary, woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Tonight, we will explore both the small and the large, the daily lives of villagers and townsfolk, the chronicles of rulers and physicians, the mysteries of medieval medicine, and the contrasts between peasants and the wealthy. So, settle yourself comfortably, let your breath slow. Imagine a candle flickering faintly against a stone wall. Imagine the quiet hum of distant voices, muffled by the thickness of wooden doors. Imagine yourself walking softly into the past. And let us begin with the simplest, yet most important question. What was daily life like for an ordinary person on the eve of the Black Death? Imagine yourself in a small medieval village in Europe. Sometime around the year 1346. The air is cool, heavy with the smell of damp soil and wood smoke. The houses are simple, timber frames filled with wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw. Light is scarce inside, with only small windows, perhaps covered with oiled cloth or shutters that creak open during the day. You rise at dawn, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the crowing of roosters and the slow stirring of animals in the byre. Life is organized around the rhythm of daylight. A peasant's first task is often to tend to the animals feeding chickens, milking a cow, or leading pigs to forage. Meals are simple and repetitive. Dark, coarse bread made of rye or barley, a pottage, a thick stew of peas, beans, or cabbage, sometimes flavored with onions or leeks. Meat is rare for the poor, though salted pork might appear on feast days. Ale, weak and cloudy, is the everyday drink, safer than water from the well. The taste is sour but familiar, warming the stomach before the long hours of labor. Clothing is plain. Wool garments dyed in muted shades of brown, grey, or dull green. A tunic belted at the waist. Simple shoes of leather or wooden clogs. For women, long dresses with aprons, kerchiefs covering the hair. Everything is homespun, often patched and mended many times, softened by years of use. The rhythm of life is not hurried. Work is steady, repetitive, and deeply tied to the seasons. In spring, ploughing and planting. In summer, tending to crops. Autumn brings the harvest, and with it, long days of bending, cutting, gathering. Winter slows life, but also brings hunger if stores are short. The work is hard, yet predictably patterned, known for generations. And then, whispers begin to travel. At first, faint, carried by merchants, sailors, and messengers. A sickness in distant lands. A pestilence spreading westward. Few pay much attention at first. Rumors of calamity often come and go. Life in the village continues as it always has. But soon, the pattern breaks. One day, someone in the village falls ill. The person weakens suddenly, their body struck by fever and chills. Buboes, swollen lumps, appear beneath the arms or along the neck. The illness moves swiftly, leaving families shaken and fearful. Word spreads that this is the same affliction spoken of from afar, the Black Death. Imagine the atmosphere in the village then. The once steady rhythm of life is interrupted by unease. People avoid one another's touch. The church bells toll more often, marking not only the hours of prayer, but also the passing of neighbors and kin. The priest speaks of God's wrath, of sin, of judgment. Some turn to prayer with renewed fervor, gathering in candlelit churches heavy with incense. Others withdraw, uncertain and afraid. Yet life does not stop entirely. The animals still need tending. Fields still require care. Bread must still be baked. Even in the shadow of sickness, daily duties press on. This is the paradox of life during the plague. Terror and routine intertwined. Markets, once bustling with chatter, grow quieter. Stalls stand half empty as traders fear travel. The once familiar sound of laughter and gossip is replaced by hushed voices, carrying tales of more deaths in nearby towns. The scent of herbs and smoke drifts through the streets as people hang fragrant bundles in doorways, hoping to purify the air. Rosemary, sage, lavender, pleasant, comforting aromas, though powerless against the sickness. Children, who once played freely in open spaces, are now kept close by anxious parents. Their games are quieter, subdued. The normal noise of village life feels dampened, as if muffled by an unseen weight. And so, the rhythm of their lives shifts, but does not entirely break. Work continues, but under a veil of unease. Prayer continues, but with a sharper edge of desperation. Evenings still fall with the soft glow of hearth fires, the smell of smoke clinging to woolen clothes. But in the silence between conversations, there lingers the knowledge that tomorrow may bring loss. As you imagine this world, you may notice how similar and yet how distant it feels. The daily meals, the steady work, the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, all familiar in their simplicity, and yet the shadow of the plague casts everything into uncertainty. Now that we have stepped into the daily rhythms of village life, let us turn our attention to one figure who lived through this world, Giovanni Boccaccio, a writer from Florence, whose careful observations of the plague have survived to this day. Imagine Florence in 1348, a wealthy city, known throughout Europe for its fine textiles, for its banks and trade, and for its growing reputation as a center of learning and art. The skyline is dotted with church towers and half-built cathedrals, while the narrow streets below echo with the sound of craftsmen at their work hammers tapping on stone, looms clicking, apprentices calling out to one another. Here, Giovanni Boccaccio was a young man, born to a merchant family, already immersed in poetry and stories. He would later compose the Decameron, a great work of literature. But at this moment, he was simply an observer of life in his city, moving through its crowded markets and winding alleys, watching as the patterns of daily life began to bend under the weight of the Black Death. Boccaccio was not a physician, nor a ruler, nor a priest. He did not command armies or prescribe cures. He was, instead, something perhaps more enduring, a recorder of experience. He wrote with a calm eye, noting how the people of Florence responded to the arrival of the plague in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. In his writings, he described how families came under terrible strain. Some parents, overcome with fear, left their children untended. Some spouses abandoned one another in the hope of saving themselves. Neighbors, once bound by habit and friendship, closed their doors and avoided even the most casual contact. Yet he also noted the opposite response: people who gathered in small circles, determined to eat, drink, and make merry, as if laughter and music could drown out the tolling of church bells. These differing reactions remind us that humanity is always varied, even in the face of the same threat. Some retreat inward, some turn to prayer, some give themselves to joy, some try to carry on as though nothing has changed. Florence, in those days, was a mosaic of all these choices, every street holding both silence and laughter, both prayer and denial. The Black Death's arrival in Florence was sudden but not unexpected. News had already reached the city of a sickness spreading across Europe. Merchants brought tales of strange fevers in the ports of Genoa and Pisa. Sailors whispered of entire crews lost to the illness before ships could dock. And so, when the first citizens of Florence began to fall ill, fear was already waiting. The sickness moved with unsettling speed. A person might be healthy one day, weakened the next, and gone within a few days more. Boccaccio described the appearance of swellings what we now call buboes along the neck, beneath the arms, or in the groin. To his contemporaries, these marks were mysterious, terrifying signs of invisible corruption. To physicians, they were puzzles to be studied, symptoms to be noted in careful Latin. But to ordinary people, they were symbols of fate, visible reminders that life could vanish as quickly as a candle blown out. Medicine in Florence was both sophisticated and powerless. Physicians carried knowledge from ancient Greek and Arabic texts, rich with theories of humors, vapors, and celestial influences. They prescribed herbs, diets, and bloodletting, hoping to restore balance to the body. They burned aromatic woods, spread vinegar on walls, and instructed households to avoid certain foods. But despite their efforts, the plague continued to move steadily through the city. Florence became quieter. Stalls in the market stood empty, where once wool merchants and spice traders had bargained. Apprentices no longer shouted in workshops. The air grew heavy with incense from churches, where priests led processions, chanting prayers, their voices echoing off the high stone walls. Bells tolled constantly, marking not only hours of the day, but also the passing of countless lives. And yet, despite all this, the city did not entirely collapse. Bread was still baked. Some markets reopened. Children still played in courtyards, though their laughter was subdued. Weddings still took place, though smaller, quieter, without the feasts of earlier years. The pulse of life continued, though muffled, like a heartbeat beneath layers of cloth. From Florence, the Black Death spread outward. It traveled along the trade routes that connected Europe, moving with the flow of goods and people. Over the Alps, it went into France and Germany. Along the rivers, it traveled, reaching the Low Countries. By sea, it crossed the English Channel, arriving in Dorset in 1348, and then spreading inland until it reached London. Chroniclers in England and France recorded similar scenes. Mass graves dug hurriedly beyond city walls, priests overwhelmed by the sheer number of burials, and villages left half empty. In England, King Edward III watched as his own daughter, Joan, fell victim to the plague while travelling abroad. In France, King Philip VI ordered public processions of prayer, hoping to appease divine wrath. In smaller towns, local lords attempted to maintain order, though many themselves fled to countryside estates, leaving their subjects to fend for themselves. The church bells rang in all these places, as they did in Florence. The sound of bells was one of the most constant features of the plague, years an ever-present reminder of mortality, but also a rhythm of continuity, marking time as it always had, even in a world unsettled. And in the midst of this, Giovanni Boccaccio continued to write. He took what he saw and transformed it into the Decameron, where 10 young Florentines, fleeing the city, passed their days in the countryside by telling stories to one another. These tales are playful, comic, sometimes moral, sometimes romantic. Their lightness stands in stark contrast to the darkness of the world they fled. Boccaccio's work reminds us that human beings are more than their struggles. Even in times of fear and loss, there is laughter, there is art, there is storytelling. His quiet testimony carries across the centuries, soothing in its balance. It does not deny the reality of suffering, but neither does it forget the resilience of life. And so, in Giovanni Boccaccio, we find both a biography and a reflection of the time. Through his eyes, we glimpse Florence not only as a city of plague, but also as a city of voices, of choices, of stories. His words gently guide us into the broader landscape of mystery. How the Black Death was understood, how people sought to explain it, and how their explanations still intrigue us today. From the streets of Florence, then, let us drift outward to the mysteries of medieval medicine, to the cultural responses that arose, and to the archaeological traces that help us understand more fully the hidden world of the Black Death. As we drift further into the story of the Black Death, it is natural to wonder, what did people of the time believe about this strange and terrible illness? And how do we, centuries later, continue to search for answers, unearthing both material remains and cultural echoes? In the 14th century, medicine was a blend of knowledge and speculation. Learned physicians read texts from the ancient Greeks, Hippocrates, Galen, as well as works translated from Arabic scholars such as Avicenna. These writings emphasize the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to result from imbalance. A fever, for instance, might suggest excess heat, which could be treated with cooling herbs, careful diets, or even bloodletting. But the Black Death confounded these expectations. Its suddenness, its severity, and its scale seemed beyond explanation. In cities like Paris, councils of scholars gathered to discuss its causes. One famous report concluded that the plague was the result of a rare planetary alignment. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had gathered in the night sky, producing poisonous mists that corrupted the air. For ordinary people, explanations varied. Some believed the illness was carried by foul-smelling vapors rising from the earth, especially from swamps or decaying matter. Others saw it as divine punishment for sin, a reminder of human frailty. Some whispered that outsiders, foreign merchants, or in some tragic cases, local minority groups were responsible, poisoning wells or spreading disease. These rumors, unfounded and fearful, sometimes gave rise to violence, adding human sorrow to natural disaster. The cultural responses to the plague were many. In churches, processions of penitents wound through the streets, chanting prayers, singing hymns, and carrying relics. Groups of flagellants men, who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in public sought to atone for the sins of humanity. In quieter homes, families lit candles, burned fragrant herbs, and hung charms or symbols above their doors. In wealthier households, doctors devised protective clothing, long robes, gloves, and sometimes masks filled with aromatic herbs. The most enduring image is that of the plague doctor with his long beaked mask, though this became common slightly later, in the 17th century, not in Boccaccio's Florence. Still, the image lingers as part of the cultural memory of the Black Death. Beyond the explanations of the time, archaeology has provided us with more answers. In London, during modern construction, workers have uncovered mass graves dating to the plague years. Long trenches filled with orderly rows of skeletons, sometimes hundreds together, tell the story of hurried burials. The bones themselves are silent, but analysis of the teeth has revealed DNA from the bacterium Yersinia pestis, confirming the identity of the plague. In villages abandoned during the 14th century, archaeologists find traces of daily life left behind pottery tools. Even half-finished loaves of bread carbonized in ancient ovens objects, suggesting sudden departures. These discoveries, though clinical in nature, still carry a quiet weight. Imagine standing at the edge of a medieval burial trench, the earth disturbed, the air cool and still. There is no horror here, only a sense of distance, of continuity. Centuries have passed, yet the remains are reminders of lives once lived, of farmers who sowed seeds, of children who laughed in courtyards, of mothers who spun wool, of fathers who carved wood by lamplight. The archaeology of the Black Death brings us not closer to terror, but closer to empathy. The cultural imprint of the plague also lingers in art and literature. In frescoes and manuscripts of the late Middle Ages, we see the appearance of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Skeletons, sometimes playful, sometimes solemn, are depicted leading kings, bishops, peasants, and children alike in a great procession. The message was clear. Death does not discriminate. Rich and poor alike are called to join the dance. These images, though macabre, are strangely comforting in their equality, reminding viewers that mortality is a shared condition. Literature, too, preserved these impressions. Boccaccio in Florence, Petrarch in Avignon, and many lesser-known chroniclers wrote of their experiences. Their words do not dwell in gore, but in atmosphere. The silence of closed shops, the tolling of bells, the quiet unease of households. Through them, we glimpse not only fear, but also resilience, how people continued to tell stories, to write letters, to compose poems, even in the shadow of illness. There were also mysteries that remain unsolved. Why did the plague strike some regions more harshly than others? Why did some villages vanish entirely, while others endured? Modern science offers partial answers: the role of climate, trade routes, population density, and the presence of rats and fleas. Yet, not all mysteries yield to explanation. There remains a sense of unpredictability, of chance, in how the Black Death moved. Imagine yourself as a villager confronted with this uncertainty. You do not know of bacteria, or microbes, or vectors. You know only the rhythm of life disrupted, the unpredictability of fate. To you, the illness seems to descend from the air itself, or perhaps from the hand of God. The mystery lies not only in its cause, but in its meaning. And so, the Black Death lives on in both archaeology and culture. In the quiet rows of skeletons uncovered beneath city streets, in the frescoes of skeletons leading kings to their final dance, in the stories of young men and women telling tales in the Tuscan countryside. Each fragment adds to the picture, though the whole remains elusive, as mysteries often do. From these mysteries, let us now turn to the contrasts of society. For while peasants labored and priests prayed, the wealthy and the noble experienced the Black Death in different ways. Their houses, their diets, their choices of retreat or defensal shaped their encounter with the same illness. As we move deeper into our journey, let us shift our gaze from the shared experiences of ordinary villagers to the differences that the plague revealed between classes, between rich and poor, between those who labored in the fields and those who governed from halls of stone. Imagine, once again, the life of a peasant during the years of the Black Death. His world is small, A village, perhaps no larger than a cluster of a few dozen houses, surrounded by strips of cultivated land. His diet is plain, his clothing rough, his labor unending. When the plague arrives, his options are limited. He cannot easily leave. His family, his fields, his animals, these tie him to the soil. Even if fear gnaws at him, he continues to rise with the sun, to tend to the earth, to care for what must be done. For him, the plague is endured in place with prayer and hope. Now, contrast this with the life of a nobleman. In Florence, in Paris, in London, the wealthy withdrew from crowded city streets to their country estates. Surrounded by high walls, tended by servants, they hoped to outlast the sickness in isolation. Their diet was richer, their homes more spacious, their clothes woven of finer cloth. If illness reached them, they had access to physicians who prescribed remedies, though often ineffective. They offered comfort in the form of attention and ritual. The noble household could retreat, could surround itself with music, with hunting, with feasting, as a way to preserve normalcy while the world beyond their gates faltered. The clergy occupied a middle place. Many priests remained with their congregations, hearing confessions, offering the last rites, burying the dead. Their role brought them into close contact with the sick, and many fell ill themselves. Monasteries, too, were not spared. Entire communities of monks and nuns disappeared, yet some higher-ranking clergy, bishops and abbots, had resources to retreat to more isolated estates, balancing duty with survival. The church as an institution both suffered greatly and, at the same time, gained influence, as people turned to it for answers, prayers, and solace. The differences in experience also extended to women and men. For women, who often cared for children, the sick, and the household, the plague brought heavier burdens. Widows became more common, and with them came new roles, managing land, shops, or estates that had passed into their care. For men, especially laborers, the sudden loss of population meant fields left untended, but also new opportunities. Wages, long suppressed, began to rise in some places, as lords found themselves short of workers. In this way, the Black Death, though devastating, also reshaped society, loosening the bonds of feudalism little by little. The contrasts can be seen, too, in burial practices. A poor family might lay their loved one in a simple trench, with little ceremony beyond a prayer. A noble family, if they could, arranged for interment in church crypts, or in consecrated grounds with stone markers. Yet in times of greatest loss, even the wealthy were forced to accept mass graves. Death, in its persistence, leveled distinctions, even if the rituals attempted to preserve them. Consider also the contrasts in memory. For peasants, memory of the plague lived in oral tradition, in stories passed quietly by the hearth, in village lore about empty houses and abandoned fields. For nobles, memory was preserved in chronicles, in letters, in carefully written accounts. These records have reached us, shaping our understanding of the event. But behind every chronicle lies countless untold stories, countless unnamed lives, whose experiences were just as real. There is another contrast worth noting, that between those who suffered directly and those who profited indirectly. In some cities, merchants who survived found themselves inheriting fortunes from relatives or competitors. Land that once belonged to a family with many heirs passed suddenly to a single survivor. Entire guilds of craftsmen lost members, and apprentices rose quickly in rank. For a few, the plague created unexpected opportunity, though always shadowed by the cost of loss. In architecture and art, the contrasts appeared again. Wealthy patrons commissioned chapels, frescoes, and altarpieces as acts of devotion and remembrance. Churches filled with images of saints thought to protect against plague. Saint Roch, Saint Sebastian, figures pierced by arrows or marked by illness, yet standing firm in faith. For peasants, such art might be glimpsed only in a parish church, where a painted panel glowed dimly in the candlelight, offering comfort through symbol rather than possession. And yet, amid these contrasts, the plague revealed a fundamental sameness. The poor man in his field, the noblewoman in her estate, the monk in his cloister, all shared vulnerability. The illness did not distinguish between silk and wool, between stone manor and timber cottage. The bells tolled in rich and poor parishes alike. The Danse Macabre, with its imagery of skeletons leading all people in a common procession, captured this truth, that in death all distinctions fall away. The Black Death, then, was both a great divider and a great equalizer. It exposed inequalities of wealth, of power, of choice, but it also blurred them, drawing rich and poor alike into the same shadow. From this tension arose a new world, one in which labor was more valued, one in which social structures shifted, one in which the memory of shared loss lingered long after the sickness had passed. And so, as we leave behind this comparison of lives and deaths, of privilege and necessity, let us return to our own place in time. The past lingers not only in chronicles and ruins, but in quiet reminders that we, too, live with uncertainty, that we, too, rely on community, and that we, too, seek comfort in stories, just as they did centuries ago. As we bring our long journey to a close, let us pause once more and breathe deeply. The story of the Black Death is heavy, filled with sorrow, with fear, with loss beyond measure. Yet it is also a story of endurance, of people who lived, who remembered, who carried forward lessons into the centuries that followed. The plague reshaped villages and cities. It weakened old structures and gave rise to new ones. It altered the rhythms of work, of faith, of community. It left behind art, rituals, and chronicles that remind us of both devastation and resilience. It whispered into every life, whether humble or exalted, that all are bound together by the same fragile thread of mortality. But as you rest here in the safety of the present, let that knowledge become not a weight, but a kind of comfort. The people of the 14th century lived through shadows that seemed endless, and yet generations followed. Fields grew green again. Towns rang once more with laughter, with markets, with music. Even after great silence, life returned in its patient, steady way. In this quiet, allow yourself to imagine those empty streets filled again. The sound of a plough drawn across the soil, the warmth of sunlight through stained glass in a village church, the hush of candles in a cloister, the laughter of children running once more in fields once thought abandoned. Their world passed into history, and so, too, will ours someday. What remains, always, is the human desire to endure, to find meaning, and to tell stories. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you are part of that same current, part of that long human tradition of remembering and reflecting. So let your breathing slow, let the images of villages, of fields, of churches fade gently in your mind. Let the sound of distant bells soften until it is only silence. You are safe, you are here. The story has been told, and now you may rest. May sleep come to you gently, like the turning of the seasons, like the soft closing of a book. And as you dream, May you carry with you the quiet assurance that even in history's darkest hours, light has always found its way back.